Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Spannerman again here with another video. Hope you enjoyed the video today. Please subscribe to the channel. Any comments, thumbs up. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Spannerman again here. Today I want to debunk the theory about when companies talk about keeping the teeth the same length. So what a lot of companies are trying to tell you to do is find the worst tooth, mark it, file it, and make it the master cutter. File all teeth the same size for both left and the right side teeth. So Still will tell you to do this. Oregon will tell you, Husqvarna, quite a lot of the chain companies will all tell you to do it that way. And I'll tell you that yes, while I agree in principle that that is a good way of doing it, there is an alternative, and the alternative is that you don't count file strokes, you don't measure teeth with a vernier caliper. In principle, I agree, you try and keep them the same length, but it's not critical. Okay, then you'll get comments and emails and all sorts of things will say, well, hang on, who are you to say that you know more than Still or Husqvarna? You know, this is an international company, it's been around for a long time, and you're telling us that they've got it wrong? No. I'll give you a perfect explanation why they tell you to do it that way. And if I was in their position, I'd be doing the same thing. When you give people instructions to do something, no matter what it is, you have to write idiot-proof instructions. You've got to make them foolproof so people don't make a mistake. Still can't afford for people to sharpen their chainsaw having teeth longer or shorter than the other because it will cut crooked. Then they're going to get complaints. People say, oh, your chains aren't no good, they cut crooked. Yeah, as long as it's not bar related. So to avoid that problem, you're much better off telling people, if you keep the teeth the same size left and right, and you make sure that you file your depth gauges all the same length, so everything's being equal, your chain will cut dead straight. It's foolproof. And it's probably the safest option to go with. So why am I saying to you that it doesn't matter what size teeth you are, as long as you get the depth gauges right? Because that's true. Buck and Billy Ray has been doing it for years. He doesn't count file strokes. Many people out there do not count file strokes. As I've mentioned in some of my other videos, who cares whether you've got half a dozen teeth that got damaged because you hit a rock and you file them, they're a mil or two shorter. Long as the depth gauge is set correctly, that will limit the amount that the tooth cuts, and that won't affect it cutting crooked. You got people out there with digital verniers that are measuring their teeth and filing them and getting them perfect. You know, you got people that have really taken this literally. And as I said, you've got to realise that this is a multi-billion-dollar company. You're talking, some of these companies are worth mega dollars. They can't afford lawsuits or bad publicity. So they have to go down the path that seems to be the best way. And it's the same as when you learn to drive a car. You're taught a certain way. And you can develop a different technique after that. But when you go for your license, that's the way you've got to drive. That's the way you've got to do it. 2 hands on the wheel. Imagine going for your license and using one hand. They'll fail you. Anyway, so it's interesting when we talk about how people get set in their ways and companies get set in their ways. Especially when they've been doing things for many years. Very, very reluctant to change their methods, even though the other method could be better. And one such thing that's in the chainsaw industry, and it was invented by Joseph Cox in Portland, Oregon, was the depth gauge, after he invented the Cox chipper chain and put a worldwide patent on that. But he also invented depth gauge that looked like this at the front, and he had another version that was 25 thou at one end and 30 thou at the other. Didn't have all these little slotted windows, but it virtually looked like this front section here. And so you had different versions of it. He also had a version that had a little dial on it, and you could set different depths. Wish they had that today. Also, it was hardened. The garbage you get from Oregon today is steel that's soft that you can file. This particular gauge by steel has got a Rockwell hardness of 62, and you won't file that with a file. You run a file straight over it because this is harder than a file. This gauge is outdated. They're still telling people to use this gauge because they're set in their old-fashioned ways that go back to early 1950s. But there was another pioneer out there in the chainsaw industry, and as there was a lot of pioneers back in those days, and this particular man was called Ray Carlton. He made chainsaw chain, Charlton chain, which is available today. But he invented the progressive depth gauge. Now, the big difference was that gauge didn't sit on 4 teeth. It wasn't a constant depth gauge, because a constant depth gauge like this that Joseph invented would only measure 25 thou or 0.65 of a millimetre. So wherever you put it, that's all you would be able. That would be the difference between the tooth and the depth gauge, 0.65 of a millimetre on a 3/8 chain. On a 404 chain, it was, I think, 0.8. So the relationship between the depth gauge and the tooth is this angle here. So this angle here is called the attack angle between here and here, and as the tooth comes down, it gets into the attack position. And we won't go into that, but your depth gauge needs to be at a minimum when the chain's brand new, 0.65 of a millimetre. By the time you get down the end of the life, it's around about 1.2 millimetres. So you really need a progressive depth gauge like this. And as I said, Ray Carlton invented that in about 1968, I think it was, or 65, somewhere like that anyway. Put a worldwide patent on it and called it philo plate. A lot of the professional loggers out there started to realise that that type of depth gauge had a lot of benefits, but you still had a lot of the people there set in their old-fashioned ways that still use this gauge and still use this gauge today, because they're reluctant to change. So for those people out there that wanted to look, as they say, think outside the square, they started using this type of depth gauge and getting much better results and much faster, because you can run the file over the top, because this got a Rockwell hardness of 62 and a file is roughly a Rockwell hardness of about 60. So this you can set on top of the tooth and file straight over the top, as you'll see on some of the videos that I've got. So I can understand Stihl, Oregon, and all the other companies out there. As I said before, they're trying to show you how to do something without you making mistakes. And if they tell you don't worry about the size of the length of the tooth, then you'll get people that say, oh, it doesn't matter how long the teeth are. You'll get people in that situation that won't be checking their depth gauges, and the saw will be cutting crooked. Then they're going to get emails, telephone calls, complaints, and saying something wrong with your chain. It's all cut and crooked. Everything's wrong. And that's the reason why you have to have instructions to make it idiot-proof. You have to make it that way so people don't stuff up. One thing about humans, we'll all stuff up. Sooner or later, no matter what you do, if you're not familiar and you're not experienced, you're liable to make mistakes. Especially with chainsaw. You can't afford to make mistakes. And that's why people are trained that way. That's why the videos show you find your worst tooth, mark it, file it, measure it, make every tooth exactly the same length, left and right. As I said, you'll get people out there using a digital vernier caliper and measuring teeth. There's also people out there that even will tell you use a shifting spanner. So you'll put that on your worst tooth. You'll adjust the jaws of the shifting spanner and you can use that as a gauge to measure the teeth. That's a poor man's digital vernier, but you can do it that way. And even myself, going back probably 5 years ago, I was of the same opinion. I'd watch some of these videos on YouTube and listen to people saying keep them all the same length. And to me, it made perfect sense that if they were the same length, that they would cut even. And then, you always heard stories about why is my chainsaw cutting crooked? It could be bar related. One side of the rail is lower than the other, so the chain leans over to the side, it'll cut crooked. If the gap is too big in the bar and the chain's sloppy in there and it's leaning to one side, it can cut crooked. But if your bar is in good condition and you're still cutting crooked, it'll be tooth related or depth gauge related, combination of both. So if you just file or grind your teeth, take off the bare minimum of metal, and then make sure that you use a progressive depth gauge to set the depth gauge that will limit the amount of timber that the tooth can cut. This is the way that I do it. This is the way even Buck and Billy Ray in America does it. This guy's one of the best hand filers in the world. And he'll tell you the same thing, that he doesn't count file strokes. And he even done a demonstration where he actually shows you that all the teeth are all different. And he goes out in the backyard and he chops a big piece of wood and it cuts perfectly dead straight. But as I said, if you're a big company, you can't teach people that way because you've got to make it foolproof. And that's the main thing. You have to make it foolproof so that you can guarantee that if they follow your instructions, that saw will cut dead straight. Still, Husqvarna, Oregon can't risk people doing the wrong thing, so they train them and teach them the way that they can't stuff up. And I agree with that 100%, that if you have to teach people that way. There are alternatives, and it's only when you get advanced and when you get much better at filing or sharpening that you can look at the alternative. And the alternative is don't count file strokes, don't use a digital vernier, don't measure left and right, make sure you use a progressive depth gauge. You'll be spending less time sharpening your chains. If you're a pro logger and you're filing your own chains or grinding them, you don't want to be spending time taking excess metal off, because the way that they teach you is they say, look at your worst tooth. So, okay, let's take that to the nth degree. You come back, you look at your worst tooth and it's got a bit of a chip in it. There's about 2 millimeters you've got to remove off that. So they're telling you mark that as your master link. So you file it all up and you go, wow, I've removed 2 mil. Are you going to remove 2 millimeters off every single tooth? You're going to be there for another hour hand filing. That is unrealistic, and that's, to me, that's just absolute garbage. But that's what they tell you to do, because they're telling you that if you keep every tooth the same length, left and right, your saw will cut straight. And provided you do your depth gauges as well, yes, it will cut straight. But that's not the only way that you can do that. There are alternatives. Look, I hope that really debunks that myth that you don't have to have every tooth exactly the same length. But as I said, if I was representing Still or Oregon, I would be recommending their way because of the people that get it wrong. And from a legal point of view and all the, look, when you're a company as big as that, it's not so easy to turn around and say, hey, let's do it this way, or let's change this, or by the way, this depth gauge really isn't as good. They've been selling this depth gauge since 50 years. They've had this type of depth gauge out there, 60 years, I think it is. So, it's only since 2017, 5 years ago, that this was made by Still, that they released it. And even then, if you go into a Still shop, you have to order it in. I was talking to one guy in America, and he was telling me that he can't even get them in his town. And I said, oh, surely you'd be able to get them in. So yeah, it depends what people get used to. And then I found out another strange thing that happened. I was talking to another American guy, and he was telling me that in his town, where where they do a lot of logging, that they only use 050 gauge. They don't use 063. And I think, well, that sounds a bit odd. So people are reluctant to change because Joe Bloggs, maybe he's the head logger out there, and he recommends 050 gauge. So everyone in the town starts getting 050 gauge because Joe Bloggs said it's the best thing since sliced bread. And this is what can happen. People follow other people, and they won't deviate or change, because if Joe Bloggs says that 050 gauge is the way to go, people will follow. It's the same as how people say full chisel and semi-chisel. Some prefer full chisel, some prefer semi-chisel. I prefer full chisel because it's more aggressive. Yeah, if I hit dirt, it's all over and I've got to resharpen, but most of the time I never hit dirt. So it depends what you get used to, but please have an open mind when it comes to sharpening and keeping your teeth the same size or not keeping the same size. There is an alternative. It's not the only way to sharpen. So yeah, keep your mind open. Thanks for watching. Give us a thumbs up, and any comments will be greatly appreciated. Bye for now.